today. Vita, over to you.
On behalf of Plaksha University, I'm delighted to welcome you to our 5th Tech Talk today. My name is Sumita Ambasta, and I'm a founder of Flowering Tree Incorporated, as well as a founder and trustee at Plaksha University. Plaksha University is an initiative of 80+ technology leaders and entrepreneurs to set up a university to reimagine technology education. One of our big goals is to use technology to solve some of the biggest challenges which our society faces today. Plaksha campus is coming up in Chandigarh and will open next year. With Plaksha Tech Talks, our mission is to get eminent speakers and experts from all over the world. These are people who are at the forefront of using technology to solve challenges that we face. For our talk today, we are delighted to have Dr. Genevieve Bell with us. Dr. Genevieve Bell is a distinguished professor, director of the 3A Institute, that's 3AI, and Florence Violet McKenzie Chair at the Australian National University, that's ANU. She's also vice president and a senior fellow at Intel Corporation, so she wears several hats. She's best known for her work at the intersection of cultural practice and technology development, and as an influential voice within academia, industry, and government. So there's a lot we can learn from her. Dr. Bell joined ANU in 2017 after having spent 18 years in Silicon Valley, helping guide Intel's product development and social science and design research capabilities. In 2017, Dr. Bell was appointed the inaugural director of the 3A Institute, co-founded by ANU and CSIRO's Data 61. The Institute's mission is to establish a new branch of engineering to responsibly and sustainably scale AI-enabled cyber physical systems. This is what she's going to talk to us about today. Dr. Bell completed her PhD in cultural anthropology at Stanford University in 1998. In 2020, Genevieve was appointed an officer of the Order of Australia. So some housekeeping. During the talk, Dr. Bell will be speaking for about 25 to 30 minutes. This will be followed by an interactive Q&A session. Our moderators today are Pallavi Jain from the program team at Plaksha University and Praveen Sridhar, who is a student at Plaksha Tech Leaders Fellowship. Feel free to put up questions as and when they come to your mind. Please use the Q&A feature on Zoom to put your questions, not the chat feature. We would appreciate it if you could put your name and designation with your question. For those of you who are joining on Facebook Live, please note that you will have to log into Zoom to be able to ask questions. The link is available on our page. It is my pleasure to welcome Dr. Bell. Thank you for doing this. Over to you.
Well, it's absolutely my pleasure to be here, and we'll see if we can share my screen now and make it all work, just like magic. Boom. I love it when that works. So my name's Genevieve Bell, and I'm incredibly excited and a little bit daunted to be here. I'm watching the participant count click over 1,000. So wherever I find you and this finds you, and I say hello. Because I'm sitting in Australia, I want to begin this the way we begin all of our talks and presentations and events in Australia, by acknowledging where we are, which is on the lands of the First Nations of this country. And I want to pay my respects to elders past and present and acknowledge leaders emerging in Indigenous communities here in Australia. For me, always doing that's a reminder that being an Australian and in Australia is both a privilege and a responsibility. And it's also the case that whenever I talk about the future, I like to remember that I get to do it from a country and in a country where people have been building technical systems for a really long time. About 2 years ago now, I went north from where I am now to the border between New South Wales and Queensland. And on that border, there's a river system. And on that river system, there's a weir that was built by Aboriginal people. It runs for about 1 kilometre. And it's a series of stone pools that trap fish and keep them cool and change the way the water moves. And it was designed to let people gather there and feed their families and their communities. That fish weir system was built 40,000 years ago. The last time it was used was in the 1930s. And whenever I think about engineering and about technology, I think about the fact that I live somewhere where people built a system that lasted 40,000 years. And I wonder what it would take to build a system that would last that way now. So what I wanted to do for the next 25 minutes was talk a little bit about the journey that I'm on here in Australia and give you a little bit of insight into the work that we're doing, with the hope that perhaps for some of you, it will be an opportunity to think a little bit differently about what you're doing and an invitation to come see us. So who am I to be talking about all of that, and why is it interesting and relevant? Well, in no small part, I have a complicated biography. You heard Samita describe it in some ways. I am an anthropologist by training, so my background is in cultural anthropology. I've spent more than 25 years in Silicon Valley working in big tech companies and thinking about the intersection of technology and cultural practice. And these days I find myself as a professor running a startup inside an old Australian university. And Samita, you said that's many hats, and I think that's right. It's many hats. I think what's most important to know about me, though, is what I value and what I care about. So I'm not just an anthropologist in my own right. I also grew up on my mother's field sites in Central and Northern Australia in the 1970s and 1980s. So I spent my childhood living with Aboriginal people on their country, hearing their stories about it and hearing what it was like to have that kind of connection. And it shaped me profoundly. When I was that age, my mother sat my brother and I down and explained to us that we had a moral obligation to make the world a better place. That it wasn't enough just to do work, the work actually had to matter. And that what was worthy and significant was that you would do work that would make the world a better place, not just for you, but for others. And that you had an obligation to make that a core value. And that it had to be about everything from putting your time, your energy, your effort on the line to do that. And so over the course of the last 30 years, I've done that in lots of different ways, whether that's been as a teacher, as an innovator, as someone building teams and building technology, and these days trying to build a new branch of engineering. So when you listen to this, what you probably should hear is someone who has been on a complicated journey that I hope isn't even finished yet. And then because I know some of you are in India and part of, I suspect, the larger Indian diaspora, what you also need to know is that I am a total cricket tragic. And I am old enough that when I was a little girl, I thought the way all fast bowlers were summoned was to chant Lily, Lily, Lily. So some of you will know exactly how old that makes me. So this diagram here changed the way I started to think. This has been really important in shaping the work we've been doing and in shaping our thinking over now the last 4 years. This diagram was published by the World Economic Forum in an article back in 2016, in which they defined the fourth industrial revolution. And they said the world was entering a period that we would know as the fourth industrial revolution. And they determined that by putting the first 3 industrial revolutions in frame and then imagining the fourth one, right? And each one of these is interesting and hugely important. So first industrial revolution, we know about the steam engine. Second one is about, well, electricity and mass production. The third one is about computing. The fourth one, they would say, was about cyber-physical systems, and I think of as being about AI. Of course, there's a problem with this diagram. Because this isn't really an interactive thing, I can't ask all 1,000 of you to tell me what the problem with this diagram is, but I'll give you a quick hint. There are no people in this diagram. There is no culture here. And oh, by the way, it's incredibly linear. It suggests that you have to have steam, then electricity, then computers. And when the World Economic Forum did it, if you unrolled it, it also suggested that these happen at particular moments in time. Mechanization in the steam engine was back in the 1700s, electricity was the late 1800s, computing was the 1950s and 60s, AI was now. And the reality is, in many places where you are probably currently sitting, it didn't happen like that. It didn't take 3.5 centuries or 250 years. It took a decade, a century. It happened concurrently. It wasn't as straightforward as saying you have to have them in this order or have them with these technologies. What this also doesn't do a very good job of talking about is what was necessary to make each one of those revolutions successful and what the social, cultural, political, and regulatory consequences were. So for each one of those, we had to develop people who knew how to operate the machinery, how to regulate the machinery, how to make it safe, how to help it get to scale. So whether it is civil engineers making steam engines into trains, into railways, into railway systems, or electrical engineers who helped standardize electricity, each one of these waves of industrial revolution required a skill set. They required a set of practitioners. They required an ability to galvanize a whole series of other resources, whether it was labor to build the railway lines, coal to fuel the trains, whether it was about creating space for factories and workers. Each one of these moments required an incredible concentration of effort, of labor, of skilled practitioners, and of creating whole ways of thinking that would shape each one of them. And so for me, when I saw this chart, I knew a lot about the first, second, and third industrial revolutions. After all, I was in Silicon Valley when I first saw this, and I'd grown up around computers. And my father's a civil engineer. Both of my grandfathers are engineers. So I had a lot of trains in my childhood. So I kind of knew these histories. But when I thought about all of them and I thought about this fourth wave of the Industrial Revolution, I had to ask myself this one big question, right? Which was going to be, who was going to be the moral equivalent of the computer science and the civil engineer for this fourth wave? What was it going to take to manage those systems and who was going to do it? And it was really striking to me because I thought, I don't think those people exist yet. And so I started thinking about what on earth was a cyber physical system? How would you describe one, right? And you can do it with a kind of an alphabet of tech terms. AI, IoT, 5G, which doesn't say much to many of us, but basically suggests embedded computing connected to the internet, powered by a robust telecommunication system, which still doesn't tell you much. Whereas you could look at this, and this is an elevator or a lift shaft inside a building in Sydney. Every single one of those lifts there is in fact powered by artificial intelligence. There's an algorithmic stack running inside this lift shaft, which now means that those lifts aren't waiting for you to press a button to call them. They're already moving through the building, anticipating where people will be. And that notion of a physical system with AI in its core, driving a set of decisions, felt like a really different thing. And then you start to imagine all the things that could become cyber physical systems. Trains, cars, certainly. We end up talking about autonomous vehicles a lot, drones, sure, but also traffic lights, the electrical system, payment systems, everything from the built environment around you to the buildings that you live in, all have the capacity to have some kind of artificial intelligence added to the puzzle. And by artificial intelligence there, clearly I mean a combination of things: algorithms, machine learning, data, sensors, and an intention of what you do to put all those things back together again. But when I started to think about all of these, drones, autonomous vehicles, smart buildings, the grid, I wondered, who are going to be the engineers for that? Who are going to be the computer scientists, and where would they come from? And I knew, because I was sitting in the places that should be making those kind of practitioners, they didn't exist. And so I thought to myself, well, we should just build a new branch of engineering. And that's a kind of bold thing to say and kind of crazy. My boss, who is the president of the Australian National University, or the vice chancellor, as we call them here in Australia, when I said to him, I want to build a new branch of engineering, he said, that's nice. And when I called him back 2 days later and said, do you understand what I'm telling you? He laughed and said, it sounds ambitious, but I'm sure you'll be fine. The good news here is that it's within living memory the last time someone did this. So the history of taking computers to scale is the history of the technology and also the people that would make that technology function. And computer science, I'm sure some of you are computer scientists, you'll know this, right? It's a discipline that owes its roots to the 1960s and 1970s and to a bunch of people at Stanford and Purdue and Oxford and some other universities around the world who created a curriculum and a way of thinking about computing, but they did it quite consciously and deliberately as computers started to go to scale. And so I thought to myself, well, maybe we could do that again. Maybe as we see the technology emerging, we could work out what are the skills, what are the competencies, what are the kinds of questions you'd need to ask. And so at the Australian National University, we started a new institute. It's called the 3A Institute. I know that's a ridiculous name, but at the time I couldn't work out what to call the new branch of engineering, and frankly, I still can't. And so I named it after the first big 3 questions I thought would be necessary, but we'll get to those in a minute. If you want to see some of the things we're doing, you can follow us here to that URL. We're also about to start recruiting for our 3rd cohort. So if you suddenly think to yourself, those sound like interesting questions, I would encourage you to come find us at that address. So how do you build a new branch of engineering from scratch in the 21st century? Well, you do it in 3 different ways. The first way you do it is you find some students who are willing to participate with you in a mad experiment. So in October of 2018, I put out a request on social media, mostly on Twitter actually, and a little bit on Facebook. And I said, help. I'm trying to build a new branch of engineering, and the university's agreed to let me take some students. I don't really have a curriculum yet, and we don't really have a name for the discipline, but would you like to come and help us bring it into existence in a kind of iterative prototyping way? And 176 people from around the world put up their hands and said they'd like to come. And we picked these 16 students to come and spend time with us. They were with us for the last year. They're just graduating next month. I can't quite believe it's been 18 months already. And they come from all over the place. They come from different disciplines. So people who have backgrounds in, yes, computer science and electrical engineering and maths, but also people who have backgrounds in law, psychology, public policy, the arts. We had people who had been in the diplomatic corps and the army, as well as people who were running their own businesses and running theatre groups and working for the government and teaching high school students. And you can tell by looking at them, they range in age from about 25 to nearly 60. And part of what I was looking for when we were recruiting this cohort was diversity, right? I wanted a diversity of thinking and of lived experiences and of backgrounds. So this wasn't just about taking the kind of people that were already in scope. It was about finding some other kinds of things. And we spent a year running an experimental curriculum that did 2 things. Gave people a set of critical toolkit in the building blocks for AI. So we taught everyone to code. We exposed everyone to algorithms and machine learning and to sensors and to building things, not just writing the code, but making it drive technology. We also expose people to the building blocks of critical thinking. So how do you go from being given a problem to solve to asking a set of questions about what the right problem really should be, and put those 2 things together. And in some ways what we were doing was teaching a different kind of systems engineering, but it was very much an experiment. It was designed to be a cohort. So I wanted to build a community of practitioners, as well as to work out what are the big questions you'd need to ask and skills you'd need to have. So the 2nd cohort has just finished their 1st semester. We're starting a PhD program in 2 months' time. And as I said, we'll be starting to recruit for our 3rd cohort, I think in about 8 weeks' time. So first of all, you teach it into existence. Then you start to work out what are the big questions you'd need to ask? What are the kind of things that you would need to train people to have to think about? So go back to that AI lift, right? Or that smart vehicle. And you realize that if you've got a physical object and it now has an AI core, there's a whole series of questions that get raised almost immediately. Is that object autonomous? And if so, what do we mean by that? So the lift is autonomous. It doesn't need a human to press a button to get the lift to come, but the lift has a series of parameters around that autonomy. It can't leave the building and go to the SCG or to the pub. It is stuck going up and down inside a very tightly bound system, but it does have some autonomy. So how do we think about what it means to be autonomous? Can you hear the birds? It's dusk here in Australia and there is a flock of parrots flying overhead. I'm sorry about that. Second question would be, does the object have agency? Or put a different way, what are its controls and limits? So go back to the lift, right? It can determine to go up and down without a human pushing a button, but can someone override it? Is there a moment where someone can tell the lift where it needs to go? And in traditional terms, absolutely. Lifts have a capacity to be overridden by emergency services. So a firefighter can put a key into a lock and make all the lifts come down. Who gets to have that override? Be the same with autonomous vehicles. Who gets to decide when those vehicles go off the road? How is that triggered? So this is a hardware question, a software question, a network question, a security question. How do you architect for that, secure it and build it and regulate it? Third set of questions are around assurance. So here I think about how will we know if the object is safe? How will we know if it's trustable? How will we know if it's secure? How will we think about privacy and manageability and explicability and ethics and standards and policies? We say assurance because that's a lot of things that you need to think about there, but basically how will we know that these objects are safe for us and safe for the world around us? Second set of, and you can see if you're paying attention, the 3A Institute is named after those first 3 A's: autonomy, agency, and assurance. But 2.5 years later, we came to realize there were 3 more questions you needed to ask about these cyber-physical systems or about the 4th Industrial Revolution, right? You needed to ask what were the indicators or metrics by which you would judge those systems? So how would you know they're good systems? If you think about the industrial revolutions, the first one at least, well, we measured those systems by productivities and efficiencies. And I think there's some ways we might want to ask some different questions now. Would we want to ask about, is the system sustainable? Is it responsible? Is it safe? If you think about those lifts, they're actually designed around saving energy. That's why they work the way they do. It's not actually about efficiencies and productivities at all. It's about energy saving. So how would we think about what the right indicators were for the systems? How do you think about what the right interfaces are? How will we as humans engage with those systems, and how will those systems engage with each other? How will you know when you come up to one of these systems that it's functioning autonomously? Do you need to know? Does every autonomous vehicle need to have a sign on it? At the moment, the answer seems to be yes, because here's a whole series of objects that we once knew how they worked and we don't know anymore. So what will be the interfaces? And then last, but also first, is the question about intentionality. What's the system designed to do, and who gets to decide that? Who gets to decide how the system functions and whether it's functioning well or not? Is that a role of private companies? Is that a role of government? Is that a partnership? Should that be scrutinized? How would you get to ask those questions? And how would you help someone build a system that was responsible and sustainable and safe? So when we think about what are the characteristics of this new branch of engineering, for us, it's about those 6 big questions. And then last, but by no means least, it's also really important to have, when you're thinking of a new branch of engineering, first you get your students, then you get your questions. Then I think you have to have a little bit of theory. So what's the underlying argument or arc of a narrative that you're prosecuting? For us, we think it's about cybernetics, which is a theory or a set of theories that were articulated way back in the 1940s, but that were really about how did we understand a system that comprised technology, in this case, computational technology, people, and the environment or the ecology. And for me, that notion of how we think about these things as a system, and a system that absolutely has to include people and the environment, feels like an important intervention into the kind of conversations we have today. So first you teach it, then you ask some questions, and then you theorize it. And then if you're really lucky, 2.5 years in, you can start to say, maybe things will stabilize. And maybe it will be the case that you'll have to have a new department. And so back in 1963, Saul Gorn, who was a computer scientist, well, he wasn't in 1963 because that didn't exist yet, but he was someone who worked with computers. And he was starting to see his peers try to articulate what a branch of engineering would be that managed computers. And it was his theory back then that it would take a little while, but eventually you'd have a new discipline or a new department that was responsible. And every time I feel like, oh, it's all a bit much, and it's a ridiculous thing to say you're going to build a new branch of engineering, I think about Saul, and I think maybe we'll get there. So with that, I'm going to stop and say thank you.
Thank you so much, Dr. Bell. That was a really eye-opening talk about the future, how we should shape it, and what are the right questions to ask. And on that note, I'd invite the audience to start putting in their questions in the Q&A box, not in the chat box. We've in fact received hundreds of questions already and can't wait to get started in terms of asking. Yeah, it's really exciting and the questions are extremely insightful. I'm conscious of the fact that we'll only be able to take a few of them in the next 30 minutes, but we'll get started on that sooner than later. So Praveen and I will be moderating the questions ahead. The first question is from Maulik Bansal. So he's referring to the Stephen Hawking quote, the famous one around the development of full AI, which could spell the end of the human race, and that it would take off on its own, redesign itself at an ever-increasing rate, whereas humans who are limited by slow biological evolution couldn't compete and would be superseded. So we've heard a lot about this quote, and we'd love to hear your reaction to this, and combining this with a question by Pratik Lamoria on warnings against the dominance of AI, and should we still be taking the chances to let AI be used for solving global challenges?
Yeah, I saw many of those questions coming in, including the Skynet and Terminator question, the singularity question. So one of the things that is always really striking to me about AI is that we have ways of thinking about it and imagining it that are shaped by at least 200 years of science fiction and of movies and of stories. Now, some of those stories come out of the Western tradition. They're stories about Frankenstein and the Golem, and in the 20th century, the Terminator and Skynet and Blade Runner. And one of the challenges for many of us is that our imaginations about a technology have been shaped by a series of dystopic stories that are really powerful. And they're powerful stories because in many cultures around the world, the idea of humans doing the work of gods or of God is a story of danger. And the idea that humans might make something in human form is a troubling story. And so one of the ways we are frequently, I think, troubled is by the idea that we might make something that could be like us but better than us. So whenever I hear the Stephen Hawking quote or the Elon Musk quote or Bill Gates, all of them theorize on this subject, I think about a Japanese roboticist by the name of Mori, who wrote a remarkable book about 25 years ago called The Buddha and the Robot. And in that, he said that humans' imagining of robots, by which he did in fact mean AI, was that we had to remember whenever we thought about them, we were actually thinking about human capacity. And he said our fear of AI was actually our fear of ourselves, and that the worst things that had ever been done to humans were done to us by other humans. And that the thing we had to fear was not AI, but the humans who were building it. And so for me, when I think about Hawking and Musk and Gates, I often think to myself, what are the parameters and guidelines and guardrails we would need to put on a new technology? And what does it mean to think about AI as being a little bit different from the software that we built over the last 25 to 30 years, where we released it in beta into the world and waited to see what happened? I think of AI as being more like medical technologies and other kinds of technologies where we have intense regulatory frameworks and where we require an inordinate amount of scrutiny and of care. And so do I think that the singularity is a possibility, or that, generalized AI will Skynet the world? I tend to be a hopeful person and think no. But in order for us to have systems we can control, we need to think really carefully and systematically and patiently about those things.
Thank you. Praveen, would you like to ask the next question?
Right. So one of the things that we have got is that like a lot of corporations are benefiting and using AI for improving their services and products. What do you think? What is their responsibility on thinking about building safe systems and AI effectively? And do you think there is a need for a collective forum where these things can be discussed even among the companies, or is anything happening around those lines?
So there's lots of different initiatives happening around the globe to deal with responsible AI. Lots of big tech companies, both in the US and globally, have committees and policies and guidelines for thinking about responsible and ethical technologies. It's also increasingly the case that governments have standards about it too. There are standards about the ethical and responsible use of AI in Europe, in Canada, in Australia, in many other countries. Governments have also taken a path of thinking about what should their position in this be, what are the places they want to suggest regulation should happen. There are a number of new organizations starting up. There's a global partnership for AI that's being led out of Canada and France that will be starting shortly. There have been government commissions globally, one in the UK most recently, and then others elsewhere. So, in fact, the UN and the Human Rights Commission have all been working on these topics. There have also been interesting moves in the last month or so that have to do with pieces of technology that sit around the perimeters of AI. So I would look at what Microsoft announced 2 days ago about their refusal to support certain kinds of facial recognition technology. Similar moves from other big companies to say certain kinds of technology are rolling back certain kinds of technologies that they've supported in the past. And I find all of those really interesting.
Thanks. It makes sense that people are warming up and taking measures to scale effectively AI and make it safe.
Yep, but I think we still have a lot of work to do.
Yeah, definitely. So another thing, like a lot of these developments in AI have been driven by open source, right? And open access, and like ArcSci provides you very open access to research preprints, and you have lots of open source frameworks that allow you to develop these models. But still, we see that a lot of public use, let's say if a government wants to use AI for particular applications for the benefit of the public, they tend to rely on companies or corporations to do that. Instead of that, do you think there'll be, it might be better to drive these technologies in the open source itself so that contributors can contribute instead of companies doing the same?
Listen, I think it's always a complicated space, right? So we know that in lots of places where the resources sit, where the skills sit, where the data sits is a complicated puzzle. And for me, thinking about data ownership, data rights, data use, provenance of data, how data moves across national boundaries. We don't often talk about that as being part of the AI story, but it really is. And the conditions under which data is collected, by whom, for what purpose, and whether it can then be reused, I imagine are topics that are live in India right now because of the biometric projects and Project Aadhaar over the last couple of years. I know has created interesting conversations about what it means to collect data and who gets to use it. I think we're at a point where many of the legislative frameworks globally don't quite keep up because there's a whole lot of things that are now possible as data that weren't possible before. Some of it is obviously personal data, so biometric data, but some of it is more complicated. So what does it mean to have a smart electrical meter outside your home that is tracking your energy usage second by second rather than month by month, that now can say things about who's in the home, what they're using. It can get almost down to the degree of what are the appliances that are connected, says something about who you are that's intensely personal, but we don't know how to think about that inside most privacy legislation. And so for me, there are questions that aren't easily covered by when we talk about open source versus commercial versus government, as opposed to also saying we need to ask these other questions about how's the data being collected, what are the strategies for its use, what is the intentionality behind those things. For me, those feel like an incredibly complicated set of questions, not as easy as just open source versus not.
Dr. Bell, building on that, while you were speaking about legislation, there's a question from Divyanshu Giri that can there be laws of robotics or for AI as is shown in the movie I, Robot? And you were talking about the impact of sci-fi on popular opinion around AI. So if you could also share your views around how that can be used in a positive way. On one side, it creates fear, but how can it also be used in a positive way to achieve the same goal that you're trying to achieve?
Absolutely. And like you said, one of the things about science fiction that's always fascinating is it has to tidy things up really neatly by the end of the movie. So the thing about science fiction is it's always a good storyline. And of course, Asimov, who is the person who wrote the 3 Laws of the Robot, he was, of course, writing a commentary about the day he was in as much as about a future that was coming, right? And there was something incredibly simple and reassuring about his 3 laws. My suspicion is if we want to think about how we regulate a space of autonomous systems, of cyber-physical systems, it's going to be a little bit more complicated because we need to think about a whole myriad of things. For better or worse, Asimov had no idea that telecommunications systems would be able to carry data in the ways they did and that they wouldn't all be state-owned. I'm not sure that Asimov could have anticipated the idea that in certain countries there would be indigenous people who regarded their data as sovereign data, not to be covered by the state. I imagine because of where he was from, he did understand the relationship between the military, intelligence services, government, and other agencies who might want to know things. I don't think he quite understood the relationship between advertising and technology because for many of us, that's a relatively new thing. So my suspicion is how you would think about regulating in that field is always going to be complicated. But the reality is for many of the technologies that we will add AI to, there are already strong regulatory frameworks. So we think about adding AI to vehicles. We already have a lot of rules about what makes a safe car, about what makes a safe road, about how we need to think about what the degree of risk we're willing to bear is. And so many of the laws already exist. The challenge often becomes when we haven't anticipated the speed at which the technology moves, when we have technology moving across state borders, carrying with it completely different ideas. So as someone who grew up in Australia and then spent her time in the US, I know that cars have multiple reconfigurations you have to make to localize them, right? Move the steering wheel to the other side, change some of the ideas about fuel consumption, change some of the ideas about tire pressure. Same with software stacks, we localize them. And so thinking about what a localization strategy might look like with AI, how you think differently about training data sets. So in Asimov's world, I think he imagined there'd be one robot and it could go everywhere. And the reality is a robot that would work well in Chandigarh or Hyderabad may not be the same robot that would work well in Canberra or Houston. And so thinking about how you need to localize, what the local affordances and constraints might be, feels like an important part of the puzzle that Asimov didn't anticipate. No offense to Asimov, because his writing is great.
And just a follow-up question on that, you studied people in so many different countries and continents. And as you mentioned, you've also been to Chandigarh before and have studied a lot of the culture in India. What are some things that really stood out to you in terms of the culture in India and how that impacts how people use technology?
Oh, wow. Way to put me on the spot. So I was in India and indeed in Chandigarh, but it's been a very long time. I was in Chandigarh in the last century, so not even this one. Listen, I think a couple of things for me are always really striking. One is how ill-equipped the West is to acknowledge the long-standing tradition of science and technology that sits inside India. So when I think of people like Chandra Bose and his work both in early technology and radio, but also as a writer of science fiction, it's really striking. He's not part of the canon, but he probably should be. And when I think about the ways in which technology uptake in India has completely transformed the way we think about how technology scales. The very first time I was in India, I think there were less than 100 million mobile phones in the entire country, more like 40 million. By the time India got to 1 billion phones, basically, it's the fastest ramp in history in terms of phone usage and in terms of phone uptake. And the novel ways that people were using technology, whether it was the IPL, so the Indian Premier League Cricketing League, in its early days, working out how to use 3D broadcasts, working out how to think about early forms of VR and AR, working out how to instrument bats and players, were all in fact incredibly novel notions, not to mention the much more traditional and well-known software skills that exist in places like Bangalore, but also Hyderabad, the universities that sit inside India that have had a long history of producing incredibly fine mathematicians, but also in my field, people like Verna Das, so incredibly fine anthropologists, and Ranajit Guha in history. So I look at it and think, here's a place that's got an incredibly long history of actually creating technical systems and a really interesting last 20 years of scaling technical systems at a speed and a kind of coverage that is unknowable anywhere else on the planet. And indeed, the biometric project that commenced under Modi was particularly interesting in terms of what it meant to both collect personal data, but then use it to transform the banking system and to think about what that meant in terms of access to services, all of which were really interesting. So for me, when I'm always fascinated to see both a place with a really deep, rich intellectual tradition, an incredibly long-standing scientific tradition, and one where a bunch of new technologies are happening at a scale that is unimaginable anywhere else. And so for me, I always look and think what will happen next. And that's a nice thing to get to wonder.
Thank you. It's great to hear that coming from you.
Well, you know, it was an extraordinary place to get to visit, and I miss it much and should clearly come back. I also have, you know, I look at some of my colleagues who are doing work in AI. So Ashwini Ashokan, who was with me at Intel, we worked in the same team together with Mad Street Den in Chennai too. So like many different places with people doing really interesting stuff. So I look at all of those kind of projects and I think that's all really good work. And Ashwini, wherever you are, you owe me a phone call.
Great. Praveen, go ahead.
So you've spoken about like human beings' fear of irrelevance with the advancement of technology, right? And with AI, this becomes like even more when there are talks about replacing like jobs and I mean, transforming industries completely. So how do you think in general, people should approach this?
So I think there are some complicated questions that come when we talk about AI and jobs. So there's a study that came out about 2 years ago that everyone quotes from Oxford about job loss. And one of the things about that study is that it's often misquoted. So it wasn't about jobs, it was about tasks. And I think one of the things we need to be thoughtful about when we talk about AI is to work out what it means, not in terms of entire job replacement, but in terms of tasks. So sitting inside jobs, there are lots of different pieces of the puzzle. So Hal Varian, who's the chief economist at Google, he sometimes says that since World War II, the only job that has disappeared from the list of jobs that the United States government tracks is elevator men. So back in the 1940s, when the United States government first started tracking statistics about jobs, they had a category of people who run elevators, so who stand inside the elevator basically and push the elevator buttons. By the 1970s, that job had disappeared. And he basically says, listen, automation over the last 60 years has only ever killed one job, but it's changed every job because every job is now done differently, right? Whether it is the use of computers in jobs that our parents did, whether it's transformations because of the internet, mobile phones, different kinds of skills, most jobs feel and look really different than they did 100 years ago or even 50 years ago. And so I think about, are there places where AI will do a better job than humans? And of course it will, but how could it not? There are some things that large computational arrays can do that we just can't. An algorithm does not think it is time for afternoon tea. An algorithm does not get tired in the afternoon. It doesn't want to go listen to the cricket on the radio. It doesn't want to go for a walk. It doesn't think, oh my God, it's 3 o'clock on a Monday afternoon. Can I go home now? It doesn't get bored. It just keeps churning through the same data sets over and over again, right? It is infinitely patient at that level or infinitely capable. And so there are some tasks where you can imagine that if what you need to do is find a pattern in a data or find a critical piece of data, the capacity of computation to do that better than a human may well be true. And so what we should do is find places where that's actually really useful. Is that good for looking at faults in lines? Is that good for analyzing satellite data? Are there ways where once we knew that, would we change our practice? And so for me, I think a better question is not what jobs will be lost, but how will jobs be changed? And what are the skills that you'll need to be successful as those jobs change? What we can best see from some of the places where the earliest introductions of large-scale computing have come is that there's a couple of things that seem to be true. One of them is, it turns out it is really useful to know how to handle ambiguity, to know how to handle complexity, to know how to think about systems. It's really good to be able to work out what are the boundaries where the computation can be useful and what the questions are it's just not so good for, and how to be critical about those things. When some of my colleagues talk about what they're looking for in employees of the future, they tend to say things like, we'd really like to have people who were team players, who were collaborative, who were invested in the success of others, not just themselves. We need people who are good at talking to people who weren't trained the same way they were trained. So be able to talk to people who don't share your backgrounds. All of which suggests a very different educational trajectory than the ones we might have had up until now. Now, there are some jobs, clearly, that AI will be better at, and some tasks inside those jobs. But at least in the short term, so in the next 5 to 20 years, that short term, there's probably some things that the human body is still better at. Things that require an inordinate amount of manual dexterity, or dealing with an enormous amount of heterogeneity or difference. So where algorithms, machine learning, AI systems are best are things that are stationary, so fixed in place, things that require large quantities of data and clear pattern recognition. So you're looking for the same thing over and over again in one place doing one thing. What they're not very good at is things that are highly mobile, things that are incredibly heterogeneous, so things that are really varied, like this task is really different from that task, is really different from this task, with a set of pieces that are often erratic and require a little bit of judgment. So ironically, in some ways, AI is least suited to physical tasks, creative tasks, work that involves your hands, and it's most suited to white-collar jobs that require a lot of repetition and large amounts of data.
That's very interesting, Dr. Bell. And since you also spoke about a new branch of engineering in this talk and in the context of the answer that you just gave, does this also mean that apart from the new branch of engineering, does this mean that every form of education and all curriculum needs to go through fundamental change, in that the sort of skills that were relevant for the workforce in the past are no more relevant for the workforce of the future? So what does that mean in terms of how every university should be thinking about its curriculum?
I think that most curriculums will need to change over time. I think it is both about how we think about teaching as well as what we think about teaching. My suspicion is, for many universities at least, there's a different competitive landscape than there used to be. So many people on this video link are lucky enough to live in a place that has the internet, that has all the things that the internet brings. So basically a library at your fingertips, a source of data at your fingertips. I would have killed for Wikipedia at university. Oh my God. Like, I still had to go to the library, find an encyclopedia, and then chase books through the stacks. The notion of being able to see data at scale like that, oh, I love it. Like, I could be lost there for days. It's not a good thing. But for universities, there's a whole lot of other places that people who want to think and want to learn can go. They don't need to just go to a university, right? Whether it's things like the Khan Academy, teaching maths online, whether it's YouTube's endless proliferation of how-to videos, whether it is every podcast and webinar and forum like this. There's all these ways you can get to some of the world's most interesting thinkers without having to be in a university. And so I think that means universities need to think a little bit differently about what makes them valuable and why people should care. and also think a little bit more about what it means to take the best of the universities out of the universities and not just make people come to them. One of the most unexpected, I think, side effects of the pandemic that we're still in has been how many places have had to respond to being able to deliver experiences and content and the best of their ideas virtually, not in person. Now, all of that said, I still think that there's something about embodied learning, about being physically in the room with your students, that there's something about learning through your peers, not just through a broadcast, that's hugely important. I'm lucky enough to have been educated in some amazing places, and I learned as much from my peers this way as I did that way. And so I think there's something about that that still feels hugely important. But in terms of thinking about what does it mean to develop new sorts of educational experiences, what does it mean to develop new kinds of curriculum, what does it mean to think about new kinds of experiences of education? Some people call it micro-credentials or short courses and those kind of things, but I think all of those things are going to be necessary. And then for me, at least, I really wish that everyone would take some kind of course in critical thinking and some kind of course in systems thinking, because for me, those, I feel like they are two of the most important skills for the 21st century.
So the next question is not directly related to this talk, but it's related to your last answer. So you've also spoken about the difference in the education experience while people are learning online. And in some of your talks, you've spoken about the need for disconnection and the need to be away from devices for some time, downtime, etc. In the past, a lot of this was by virtue of compulsion, by virtue of temptation. Now, the need to be hooked onto devices is actually a matter of compulsion. So, what would be your advice in the current context, where it's become even harder to follow the previous advice?
Oh, such a good question. You're right. I have written about, in other places, about how it is that we need to be occasionally disconnected from technical systems and that we need to have time that is felt differently, that is definitely embodied, that's not mediated by the digital. I'm still inclined to think we need to do that. I think it's harder than it's ever been because there is so much richness in our digital lives. But, you know, at this point, the medical science, psychological, neurological data suggests that we need a break from the screens, whether it's the spectrum of the light, whether it's the Zoom gaze. There's all kinds of reasons why being disconnected turns out to be important. I think it's hard. I fail at it more than I succeed. I'm fascinated to see that where Stack does the same thing. I'm not sure we yet know how to respond to that without it feeling like something else that's nagging you. But how we think about being connected and disconnected feels like a piece of the puzzle that we should always be engaged in. Someone's just asked a question about robots and Sanskrit. That is an excellent question. I don't have a good answer. Sorry, I'm scrolling questions while you're asking them, Pallavi. I should be letting you, but I'm like, NASA, Sanskrit, and robots. Excellent.
Okay, go ahead.
Sorry, I'm just looking and going, I don't have an answer, but it's a lovely question. Ashanya.
We'll send the answer later. You could think about it offline, and then we'll email it back to the person who asked. Go ahead, Praveen. You're on mute.
Oh, a famous line I have heard a lot in the last 3 months.
So one of the common questions that was there is like, what has been your inspiration for your journey from becoming a cultural anthropologist to transitioning into leadership in technology?
Oh, such a good question. So there's the short answer, and it's terrible. So I did my PhD at Stanford. My background was still is in Native American studies. So I studied indigenous people in the United States. And I was on the faculty at Stanford in the late 1990s. And then I met a man in a bar in Palo Alto. And I ended up taking a job at Intel. That's the short answer. The long answer is, like I said, it's terrible career advice, Praveen. It's just terrible. The reality is I was particularly interested in thinking about the notion of what made people tick. And anthropology for me is all about that. What makes people tick? What do they care about? What frustrates them? What do they want for themselves, their families, their communities? And I wanted to believe that those kind of insights could be useful in all kinds of places, not just in universities. And so when the opportunity came to join a big technology company, I was terrified. Right? I didn't know anything about it. Like, I really didn't. And I think the most important thing for me was the moment of realizing that I should just go ahead and try something that I'd never done before, and that there was no shame in it going badly, and that maybe what I would learn from it would be much better than the fear of not doing it. And so in some ways, the kind of the lesson in all of that is about being willing to try new things and being a little less fearful about what will happen if it doesn't turn out quite the way you imagine. And then also being willing to think that your life might unfold in different kinds of ways than you anticipated. So being a little bit willing to, I don't know, have a slightly mad adventure. And I have to say, of all the things I've done, I've never regretted that one.
Wow, that's really.
The message there is not hang around in bars, to be really clear.
So Dr. Bell, given the time, I'll have to move to the last question. So there are a lot of high school students in this audience, and most of them, I'd say, are very fascinated with AI and are very keen to pursue careers in this. So if you could give them some words of advice on how to pursue a career in this, and particularly for people who want to pursue it in the dimensions that you spoke about and be involved in that goal. As a 9th grader, 10th grader, 11th grader, what can somebody do?
Oh, good questions. 3 things. My colleagues, the first one, that if I didn't say this, my colleagues in computer science would kill me. Please continue to study maths. Like, do maths in high school. This will help you. You may never, I mean, I did maths in high school. I did computing in high school. I put them down for 20 years. I came back. But number one, maths. Maths will always help you. It is a universal language. Second piece, I actually think you should study more broadly than that. So I actually think that part of what will make us all more successful in the 21st century is not just rigidly pursuing science, technology, engineering, and maths. I think you need to be better rounded than that. So pick something else as well, whether it is language, the arts, literature. Find something else that you can also be compelled by, for want of a better word, because I think being broad that way is really useful. So I'm basically just loading you up with things in high school. I know that. Can make your parents very happy and you very unhappy. So maths, do another thing that you can be good at, or that you can at least, I think that's the contrast piece. And then I think the third piece about it is to be willing to imagine that it won't unfold all in a straight line. So most of the most interesting people I know who've had the most remarkable careers, it wasn't one foot in front of the other, right? They went in one direction, then they went slightly in a different direction, then they did something else again. And I think you have to think that over the arc of a life, you'll end up somewhere interesting, but if you would judge yourself in any given moment in time, it doesn't feel so good. So maths, I would have said literature. I frankly find, or Sanskrit, pick something. There's other ways of sort of being in the world that you will find hugely useful. And then I think there's something about being clear about the reasons why. I've been incredibly lucky since I was a little girl to be really clear about what my purpose in the world was, about what I had to do. And I think being clear about that for yourself really helps. It's not always about doing things because other people think you should, or because you feel like that's the right thing to do because that's what everyone else does. Being able to be clear about what it is that you know you need to do maybe for yourself, maybe for your family, maybe because that's your destiny, but being clear about what it is and honest with yourself about it. Those for me feel like things in 9th grade, that feels a bit heavy, but they'll stand you in good stead. And for what it's worth, whatever computer language you learn in 9th grade will not be the one the world is still using by the time you finish university. We will have moved on to something else. I learned to program in Pascal. We don't program in that anymore. My professors at university programmed in Fortran. We rarely use that. I've learned lots of programming languages over the years. Most of them people don't use anymore. But they're useful because you learn to structure your thinking. You learn how programs work. And those are all hugely useful. So I think it's about get the building blocks right and then make sure you are doing it for the right reasons.
And those were some wonderful closing remarks, Dr. Bell. I think it gives a lot of food for the high school students to think about as they go into the weekend. Thank you so much for joining us today. It was an absolute honor for us to have you here. Thank you for making the time. And for the audience, thank you for being a very, very engaged audience. We were delighted to cross the 1,000 mark, not just in participants, but also in questions. And it was really your engaging questions, your insightful thoughts that made the session even more enriching. Thank you so much for being here today on a Saturday morning. Have a really nice weekend and stay tuned for more tech talks that come your way about the future and how we can shape it. Have a nice weekend.
You too.